All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sail, here to shine a light, not particularly this episode on a South African matter exclusively, but rather on some ideas that I think are relevant, not just for the South African context, but in the American context, in the European context, pretty much in the broader Western context and beyond. And those topics, or those the themes that we're going to be touching on tonight are matters of identity. And joining me here tonight for that, I think, very pertinent topic is contributing editor at IM 1776, and also just another one excellent cultural commentator. I mean, that's there's many things to call some of the people that regularly push out content that I think is relevant to our times, thought-provoking content. One of the last pieces that I read by my guest here tonight was actually a dialogue that he did with someone that my audience definitely knows, Marta Maid or Daryl Cooper, and it was on this topic of identity. And I thought that that topic was so relevant to today that I wanted to invite him on my show to elaborate a bit more on those matters of identity. And that guest is Lafayette Lee. Welcome on the show, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor.
So I think let's start off with on a personal note. What from the dialogue that you published on IM 17.6 with Daryl, what drove you to publish that? What were some of the things you were seeing around you? What were some of the things you were sensing in the zeitgeist, if I can put it that way, that gave you the impression that this is now a time for this conversation to at least get started, and to maybe even in the future keep it going and add to it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, it was a real privilege to be able to talk to Daryl Cooper. I have immense amount of respect for him. He's a deep thinker, but he's also pragmatic, and I find that those two things are really important as we navigate the troubles that. We talked about ethnogenesis, and we talked about kind of who we are as Americans, and this question has become very relevant. In the past, this was like being an American was just something that was taken for granted. It didn't really need to be defined. Everybody just kind of knew and felt that they were American. But we're finding that a lot of us are starting to ask, like, what is it that makes us an American? Part of that is because America's changed so much. When we talk about these things in politics, they always get intellectualized, you know. But I find that there are deeper things underpinning the way that we describe ourselves, and I think those things need to be explored. I think it's really important that we recover that sense of who we are, and I think that a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today are related, that we call political problems, are really like a crisis of identity. I kind of think that if we can solve some of these political problems as political problems, and then solve these identity problems as identity problems, that we will find ourselves in a much better place than we are today. But we conflate the two so much that it can cause a lot of problems. So that's why we had this dialogue, and it's really been an ongoing dialogue. We've had a lot of feedback from people. And I think that whoever, as I mentioned in the dialogue, whoever really wins this debate is going to determine the future of the United States and likely the world. So I think it's more relevant than ever.
Right. And why I also thought I wanted to have you on as a guest to elaborate on it, because I just finished reading a while back Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. And I mean, it's not a particularly subversive book, but it makes a lot of very pertinent points to our time. And one line stood out that I've repeated it many times on this channel. My audience might be tired of it at this point, but I'm going to keep repeating it until it sinks in more, because it clearly hasn't. And that the line was, in the post-Cold War world, the most important distinctions among people are not ideological, political, or economic. They are cultural. People and nations are attempting to answer the most basic question humans can face. Who are we? And I mean, we are pretty deep into the post-Cold War world already. And I think quite clearly Samuel Huntington was correct in his prediction that one of the defining questions of our time will be a quite simple one that many people might just brush off as trivial and not really necessitating our time. A question as trivial as who are we? But when you scratch the surface, you realize there's a lot more depth to this than just in what economic zone you find yourself anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. I really do agree with that. And I think that this is why this discussion is important, is because for too long we have, like I said before, we've intellectualized who we are. That doesn't resonate with people, and for a reason, and I think that people get shamed a lot by not adopting, an ideological position or identity, or by, describing themselves and their interests purely economically or according to some program. It's just they have to adopt a language that's not their own to be able to describe who they are. And this is one of those things that I think we have a lot of ground to make up with regular people. Like, I believe instincts matter, impulse matters, gut matters, trusting your gut. These are things that have guided us for a very long time. And I don't think that who we are resides, the top, like in the higher levels of our brains. They're very deep, and they're hard to describe. The love that a parent feels for their child, for the land that you live on. These are deeper things that you can't just explain away with like economic theory or with a political manifesto. And I think we're regaining that, like we're recapturing that, but that's who we really are, those subtle things.
And I mean, even though I'm a South African, I couldn't help but notice that some US pundits make the strangest remarks that actually show that there is a crisis of identity that Americans are grappling with currently. And it's not a direct quote, but it might as well be. I've heard so many quotes along this line of people saying things like, if you live inside the borders of America and you love American fast food chains and quote unquote freedom and guns, if that isn't a quintessential American, then I don't know what is. And I want to put the emphasis there. You probably don't know what a quintessential American is. I mean, that's me as a South African saying that. Am I on the mark, or is that actually the definition of a American?
Yeah, no, it can get pretty unbearable listening to our pundit class describe what an American is. It's always, you hear this a lot. I'm sure you hear it over there, but like, being an American is just an idea. So if you have the idea, or if you love the country, then you're an American. And that's just, that really sells America short, and that sells Americans short. And it's deeper than that, as we were discussing, is that there is not really a quintessential American. We live it's a continent-sized country with all sorts of different regions, with unique cultural differences between the people that live here. My ancestors were settlers and colonists. They came here hundreds of years ago. Some of them around the same time yours probably did, to South Africa. During all that time that they've been here, they became a new people, and they did separate themselves from the old world. But there's all these smaller, intimate things that separate us from maybe our cousins or distant relatives in other parts of the world. And those things are real, and it's more than an idea. And that's what I want to push back against. Is I don't think ideas are bad. But they aren't who we are. And if you look at it, there's kind of on an American political context, it's kind of a bit of a predatory way of describing an American. It basically is that you have to bear some kind of allegiance to someone who gets to define what the idea is. And so if, your ruling elite decide that being an American is supporting communism, then a good American would support communism. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not the way that any American has ever really viewed themselves until recently. And I think that we have a lot of ground to make up here, but I think Americans will find that, and anybody really, is that the things that are near and dear to you, the things that are close to you, the small things, the particular things, that's what makes you who you are. That's what makes you an American. It's not just, for me, it's not just having my own land. It's having my specific plot of land, having my ancestors buried here, having the bonds and the relationships that I have that are only mine. Nobody else has those in this particular place. And that emphasis on place, I think, is so much more important than what pundits will give it credit for.
There's a Serbian saying that goes, "Home is where your ancestors sleep." But at the same time, I actually want to give my audiences, particularly my Afrikaner and South African audience, a bit more context on that idea, that idea of American identity, particularly in regards to how it was in the past and today. Now, I know a lot of people, especially conservatives today, like to romanticize the past sometimes too much. But I want to ask the question in that frame of, was there a stronger sense in the past, a more assurity about what it means to be an American, something that was lost? Or has this been a conversation that's been ongoing for longer than most people think?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for us Americans, it will always be going on because America is different in many respects from the old world. We don't have, I mean, at the core, and I think it's described well this way, at the core of America and the American people is an Anglo group of people and an Anglo tradition and Anglo institutions. You can't really separate those two things. That's really kind of the bedrock, the core. And for a very long time, Americans would just identify themselves. Americans were mostly descended from English stock who had been here for quite a while. Now we've had lots of newcomers and new peoples come to America. Now where America though separates this, and this is kind of where we find ourselves we do reinvent ourselves, and that's a real thing. I don't discount that. And one of those places, as I mentioned in the dialogue, is on the frontier. The American frontier was a place where that group of people, the core, became distinct. I would argue where you see the emergence of a new civilization, where it was not simply an outpost of the Anglo, of Great Britain, but it became its own people. There was an ethnogenesis on the frontier, and that ethnogenesis blended in other peoples. That's indistinguishable. And you'll find if you go to the United States, you'll find that like in the South, most people can trace their ancestry back to Anglos, and then others there's a strong group of Scots-Irish that really did, settle parts of the Appalachia and into the West. There's also other groups. There's French as well up in the North. But these people over time and fighting through that frontier and expanding out to the other side of the continent, really, they became a distinct people. And this is why we are at this impasse now, is because in a way you earned the Rockies, you pushed your way west, and you almost earned being an American. You kind of embedded yourself in this fabric as it was creating itself. And so you became a part of this. Where I think we're at a problem now, and an impasse, is we aren't really pushing into a new frontier now. We find that Americans become who they are through struggle, through fighting, and through settling and pushing these boundaries. We're now kind of trapped within the continental United States. And as you'll notice, like the dialogue changes. It's now, well, Americans work hard. So if you want to come here and work hard and raise a family, you're an American. And that's kind of new. It was always baked in the cake. It was always part of the process of becoming a people. But there was so much more to it. Jeremy Carl, who is a friend of mine, who recently wrote a book that's really good, by the way, called The Unprotected Class. But he wrote an essay about this, talking about how the whole nation of immigrants thing is kind of misleading, because while people have immigrated to the United States for centuries, there's a part of America, the core of it is settler and colonists. These are people that were out there building a new civilization in a very savage country, and very dangerous, and it was difficult. That created a type of person, that created a mentality, and kind of there's a soul, I think, underneath that that's very real. That's very different than people that might come here in more recent years looking just for opportunities or looking to work somewhere. And that's the tension. I don't know how that's going to get resolved. I figure my suspicion is the United States will probably find itself in a very difficult spot in coming years. There will be another struggle to endure. And as the people that are here participate in that struggle together, there will be another ethnogenesis. And I don't know exactly what that will look like, but that seems to be the pattern for America. And that's what makes America different than other parts of the world.
And I mean, you touched on something absolutely critical there, and that is the forming power of struggle, of shared struggle. I mean, that's where origin myths originate. That's where they come from. I've never heard of a people when a culture or a people, when they talk about their origin myth or where they come from, that it's not a story associated with struggle. In the Afrikaner context, that would be something like the Battle of Blood River, the Great Trek, the Anglo-Boer War. These are very, very tough times, not times of prosperity or times when things were going well. And I see here, Sideliner Opinion says, affluence destroys culture faster than most other things. That reminds me of a joke that we Afrikaners often tell, and that's it's kind of a morbid joke about actually what prosperity does to a culture. So the devil wants to destroy the Afrikaner people, the Afrikaner folk, and he sends war, and he sends concentration camps, and he sends poverty, and he sends all these struggles, and they all fail. And the devil's losing a lot of his patience. He says, well, I've got only one weapon left in my arsenal, and it's my most powerful one. I'm going to send them prosperity. Let's see if they can survive that.
I love that. No, I think that's very true. Somebody said in the chat about how American culture has become commercialized. I think that's very true. I think it's hard for many Americans to separate prosperity and that commercialization of their culture. You brought it up earlier, there's kind of this caricature of an American with like a 10-gallon hat and a six-shooter, walks around with spurs on. I mean, I know people that are like this that do it for a living, right? Like there are cowboys still, but there is a caricature. There's a reason why politicians in the United States will wear cowboy hats, even though they've never worked on a ranch or done anything like that. It is because there is kind of this, this commercialization of things that were once very real to us. And I think there's always like this nostalgic desire to hold on to that. But at the same time, like I'm a soldier. That's where my background is from. So there's a part of me that, of course I look at these things kind of wistfully, but I recognize that there are these corrupting influences that make people very fat and happy and complacent. And that does destroy culture. And so in a way, I do embrace the struggle that we're going through, and America will continue to go through this struggle. But I think that in the struggle, instead of a lot of Americans are becoming very, filled with despair, but I actually think this will be a very important thing for us to go through. This will make us better in a lot of ways. These problems that we're facing here, these are problems because of those poisonous influences that have kind of helped, like, made us lose our way, right? Mm-hmm. If I know anything, is that struggle, there will be people that will fail and struggle, but there will be many people that will rise to the occasion and become better. And I think that's where you're going to see a reinvention of America yet again with this same core group of people. And so it doesn't always have to be bad. And I'm sure I know you have a good perspective on this, but I think Americans need to learn that perspective. I think generally many people have their expectations kind of preset from like the 1950s and 60s, and we just don't live in that world anymore.
Absolutely. And I mean, from the Afrikaner perspective as well, I mean, we're not our heritage is not a monoculture. We are a mixture between the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the English and the Scottish and many other ancestors. I mean, just my own personal ancestry already speaks of the the diverse influences on Afrikaner culture. I mean, my ancestors are from all over Western Europe, from Scotland to the Netherlands to Germany to even Belgium with the Flemish, so many different, and the French Huguenot, of course. But I mean, what you're talking about there is a culture that's not an ethnogenesis can take place, even though there are so many different cultures are coming together. And I just wanted to read a comment here from Conquest Theory in the chat. If StreamYard would allow me to put it on screen, it's giving me a little bit of pause there, but I'll read it so long while there we go. So Conquest Theory says, not only has America become commercialized, the entire Western world has been homogenized into some commercial monoculture. I mean, we see we see some elements of this already in South Africa as well, where young South African children are growing up with speaking in American accents. Now, where have you ever heard of such a thing? But I mean, that's the product of this great standardization. N.P. van Wyk Louw, an Afrikaner philosopher, already in the 1950s wrote about this, where he said the central drive of what Conquest Theory is describing here is a drive to create like just a gray identityless mass, and that's whether that be in regards to language, religion, or culture. And that's what we need to be resisting. We need to actually be champions of, I don't want to say human diversity, because that's a term that has so much ideological baggage attached to it, but rather let's then rather say human variance when it comes to culture, religion, language. It's comparing two scenarios where on the one hand, there's a beautiful organic rainforest filled with many different plants and animals. And then on the other hand, you have this drive to cut down that rainforest and turn it into just a pine tree plantation where nothing grows except the pine trees, just a sterile forest, but a sterile forest that's perfect for harvesting.
No, that's exactly right. I completely agree. I mean, this is where we find ourselves. And Conquest Theory, I love. He's got a great account and very insightful. I think he's exactly right. I think, and this goes into the political problems, right? What comes along with some of these political problems that we need to fight for and change, and we need to work. We really do need to advance our interests, but as particular peoples and particular individuals in the United States, it's much more who we are regionally. That's a big part of the American story and who we are. And so for us, it's clinging to a sense of particularity. Now, there are obviously broad problems and there are broad issues that we can rally around through coalitions. Those are important too. But when we're trying to understand who we are, we can't just solve those problems politically alone. And this is American struggle with this, I think, because so much damage has been done in terms of that cultural annihilation and that we've become homogenized in so many ways. But we can advance our interests, our particular interests. We can cling to those things. These are things we can all do. And then we can solve so many of these political problems as political problems. And that it will take off a lot of this stress and strain that we feel on our identity, right? I don't, in my local community, for example, I can ensure that some of these forces that are creeping in can be kept at bay. It's important to learn how to build boundaries and barriers. That's not going to be a national program. These are things that we can take advantage of on a very small scale, local scale, using the relationships that we already have. Like, we have a lot of strength in this way. And this is why I do worry about in American context, it worries me because there is this focus on the center of power constantly. It makes sense. It's hard to take your eyes off of it. But there's so much ground that we control here at a very small scale locally, that if we were to focus a little bit more about what's right in front of us, I think that we could solve a lot of these problems, these political problems, closer to home, and it would take off some of that pressure and weight on the identity questions, right? And I think that I imagine it's not too different, in South Africa. I'm sure. I mean, I've lived in other parts of the world, and many people, especially in the educated or cultured class, will often look at the United States, for example, the news, and they'll digest what's going on because that's kind of the seed of hegemony right now. That the hegemonic power. But that is in a way that's misleading. And I think that this is one of those places that everybody, no matter where you are, can do. If you seize the ground that you are standing upon, you're going to be much better off, and you're going to be more capable of solving some of these problems that we talk about. And it's really that simple. It doesn't solve all the problems, but you can solve so many problems by changing your line of sight.
And I mean, just to add to that, the America is heading for a more diverse future. I mean, I don't see anything changing in the near future that's going to change that. And the fact about that is, I mean, the core source of that is just unlimited immigration. But what the central point there is the fact that all these immigrants coming to America are coming to America with a very strong sense of identity. They're not coming to America and losing their sense of identity and becoming deracinated. They are keeping their sense of identity. From what I can see, I'm speaking under correction. But I mean, what does that mean for the future if the Americans currently living in America, or the old stock Americans even, are losing their sense of identity, becoming more and more deracinated and more confused when it comes to that very simple question of who are we? And then you flood that very same country with people from other countries that have a very strong sense of identity and have a very definitive answer when it comes to who are we. They don't even hesitate to give a very, very strong answer to that.
No, it's a very difficult problem. And I don't know if I have a solution for this. I'm trying to speak to the average ordinary person.
Absolutely.
Obviously, politicians can make decisions. They can make sweeping changes that could make this problem better, or at least try to resolve this problem. But it is very difficult. Daryl Cooper talks a lot about this. We have to keep both eyes open. I mean, this is a rapidly changing world. It's not the same America that I grew up in. And I think a lot of people in the West can identify with that now. But at the same time, every action does have a reaction. And we are seeing a reaction now, especially in the United States. This topic in and of itself was almost forbidden 20 years ago. People might talk about it, but you would, immediately, you would face a lot of like public ridicule or ostracism. And now it's at the top of everyone's minds. Every time there's amount of pressure, there's going to be some kind of response to that. And I see Americans now are starting to understand that some of these things that they're losing cannot be recovered, and then they need to hold on to them tightly. So I don't think that America and Americans will take this lying down. And I think that this is where the growth will come in, that there will be some kind of growth. There will be an emergence of a new consensus. Eventually, I think there will be, I think ethnogenesis itself, as we discussed in the dialogue, is a possibility. These are things that will happen naturally as well. So it will be a changing landscape, a changing world. But what I encourage ordinary people to do is to take control of what they can control, to speak the truth as they know it, to not be afraid to make decisions that if you can't wait on Washington to make your decisions for you, but you have to make personal decisions, and you're closer to home, to that near and dear, to be able to brace yourself for some of these changes. People that are going to be proactive here are going to be able to make it through this. But I think it's that prosperity problem. Americans have to learn that these problems won't just get solved by some power over in Washington. They have to solve these problems themselves. They have to start thinking about taking more proactive action on their local levels. Those places that do that, people that do that, they're going to make it through this chapter. Other people won't, and it's going to be very painful. But I do think that it's important that we understand that this is a fight we are all engaged in. This is something that we all need to struggle for. And there will be a creative place for people of imagination to contribute to what the future will look like. When we talk about ethnogenesis, when we talk about an emerging consensus, These things, like, people want order in their lives. We will achieve a sense of order at some point. I don't know how long it will take. I mean, I think this is a generational struggle, but there will be a new consensus that will have to emerge, at least regionally, maybe nationally. But we all have a hand in that, and people that take that seriously will have a much bigger influence over what the future looks like than people that sit back and let somebody else do it.
And just for some historical context, I mean, you did touch on it in your dialogue as well. Was there a time in American history where maybe not an exact situation, but a similar challenges were staring you in the face, where there was again many collections of groups or cultures that had a strong sense of identity, but no unifying vision or an ethnogenesis taking place? And how was that overcome if there was such a time?
Yeah, definitely on the frontier. I mean, the frontier is a good example of this. There's a historian I really favor who talks a lot about actually the diverse, they use a modern term, but the diversity on the frontier. There were many different religious groups that came to America. There were peoples that, I mean, you look at the expansion west, there's pockets of these people here, there still today. You can tell by last names. They've kind of lost some of those cultural particularities, but and adopted a more broadly American identity. But that was the story of the frontier. And what it found is that the people on the frontier didn't just all get along. These different pockets of groups of people, French, you had Indians, you had Anglo-Americans, you had Highlanders from Scotland. They didn't all see eye to eye or get along. And at the time, there were very stark religious differences, apart from just the ethnic and cultural differences that drove a wedge between communities of people. But what it was is, in America, we do have a strong tradition, a political tradition of self-determination. And so these communities were still allowed to thrive in a sense and retain certain things, certain particularities, while still trying to survive on the frontier. That process of struggle forced people to be able to cooperate to a level. And if you go back into American history, there are a lot of people that would remark that the folks on the frontier didn't always see eye to eye, and they obviously had problems. They wouldn't always intermarry, but they cooperated a lot more than the people in many of the urban centers at the time, because they had to. And I think that this sense of shared struggle in America, especially when we brace against problems today, because we do have incredible, these are big problems. Like, these are not small things. It's not just tax cuts. We're dealing with unmitigated, immigration, for example. I think that you're going to see that Americans at the local level, at the smallest level, they're going to go through the same process. You're going to find that what defines us in many respects are our obligations to other people, our relationships and commitments. Sometimes those will reach across ethnic boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries. Sometimes they don't. But when they do, and when Americans work together, communicate together, live amongst each other, they do develop a sense of unique identity, and that oftentimes looks regional. I think what muddies the water is this mass politics that is kind of what you mentioned before, where there's the caricature that gets trotted out, or the ideas, intellectualization of people's identities. But I mean, if you actually see it in real time at the local level, people actually working together, living amongst each other, and they have to work through problems together. This is where Americans, I think, will start to develop a sense of who they are. It will have to take place at a more localized level. But I do think it will be real, because the problems that we face are not going to go away, and we will have to resolve those. And people that will resolve those things together, they might have, I don't know if they'll have like more ethnic or religious solidarity or whatever, but there will be a new thing that emerges from this, because it will be defined by the problems they were forced to resolve together. And that's where I think the future will look very interesting. I don't know what it will be, but the old consensus of what it was to be an American in the 1950s is effectively dead, in my opinion.
I think a hard lesson that a lot of Americans are going to have to learn is that you simply can't build a community around ideology, much less around voting patterns. It's just not sustainable. It's like putting a little tiny bandage on an axe wound. You're going to have to dig deeper than that. It seems to me from what I can see, a lot of Americans think that they can build a community or an identity just around who you voted for in the previous election. And that's just unfortunately not going to work. It's a simple solution that it sounds like the simple fix all snake oil solution, but it's just simply not going to be sustainable.
No, that's exactly right. That is a huge problem in this country. And I think that, so I've had a lot of people reach out to me because, as I'm sure everybody knows, Donald Trump's facing a conviction. Well, he's been convicted, he'll be sentenced. So very well, like the leading opposition candidate could be in jail during the election. And a lot of Americans are very appalled by this. There's a lot of commentary on what this means. So I've had a lot of DMs of people reaching out to ask what's my temperature on this, and I have strong opinions about the conviction itself. But the point is that if we try to take a step back and take a little bit more of like a bird's eye look at what's going on in our country right now, I think Americans are learning that that way of looking at the world through a political party, of like who you are and what your interests are, that can be defined by a major political party, it's inadequate. Doesn't really work. And the problems that we're dealing with are deeper than just a Republican and Democrat, blue and red. They are civilizational problems. Who else dealt with existential and civilizational problems were our ancestors who were on the frontiers, our ancestors that were in a very different situation. So this is kind of why I emphasize not necessarily modeling everything we do off of the past, because that's a different time and place, but to draw some inspiration from the fact that, we've been in really bad spots before, and there is a way of working through these things. And we will work through this, but we have to adapt. And part of the adaptation is we have to lose this way of using politics as a lens to analyze the world around us and who we are. It just is inadequate. What it's going to be is that, as it's always been, it's Americans, and this goes for other peoples as well, but it's Americans solving the real world problems they're dealing with. In many ways, mass politics has kind of been like a sedative. It's like a drug. It helps you kind of escape from the reality that you're living in, because it always feels like as angry or as upset as you might get about the issues, that you're achieving something. And there's always the expectation somebody's working on this somewhere. Well, the reality is nobody's working on some of these issues. These are deep civilizational issues that are at your front door now. And Americans have always had to resolve some of those things up close and personal. And we have to get to a place where that's what we are doing now. And that's when things like identity and all these other questions will start to make a lot more sense. They'll be relevant. We'll start losing some of those silly things that don't really help advance anything in our personal lives. The caricatures won't hold water anymore. And this is where we will become probably, in some ways we will become who we are. And that's a good thing. It's a growing pain, but I think that this is actually a good thing.
Well, that's why I'm so glad that these types of matters are at least being discussed again. I mean, identity has been a dirty word for so long, in particular in classical liberal circles, or in ideology-based circles, where they're just like, it's only ideas that matter. Your identity doesn't really matter. I'm like, well, your identity shapes your ideas, and your identity shapes your behavior. And your identity is not necessarily something that you can just pick and choose, like, what shirt are you wearing today? It's almost like a gift that your community gives to you. Not to get too philosophical there, but the problem that I see, particularly for Americans, is that some of you are looking towards, for example, cultures or peoples like the Afrikaners, and I might be reducing it a bit too much, but almost like asking, can you help us solve this identity problem? You seem to have a strong sense of identity. How do we do it for ourselves? And my answer is always, well, I can't tell you what an American is. I don't understand your context. I've never visited America. Everything I know about America is what I see online and through media, through movies and music. I'm not the type of Afrikaners are not the people, or other cultures in a similar position are not the people you should be asking to solve your identity crisis. You can look at other cultures and peoples as case studies and get valuable insights from them, absolutely. But this is something you're going to have to solve on your own internally amongst each other. This is not something where some other foreign people or culture or nation can swoop in and come give you the winning recipe, because it's the recipe is not the same for everyone. There's not a one size fits all approach to dealing with these types of matters. It's a long process, as you've already now described. It's going to be painful, it's going to be struggle, but it has to be internal. The answer can't come from outside.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm completely with you on this. And people, sometimes I joke about it and people take it wrong. I mean, the reason why I love my country and being an American is it's mine. I mean, this is the only place it's mine. And I don't mean to dog on other places. I mean, I'll do that a little bit for fun because it's just what we do. But I agree. I look to history for inspiration. I enjoy other cultures. I find them interesting. I've spent time in Africa and I loved it, but it's just not my place. It's not my people. I have no history there. And so to me, it's more like an interesting oddity or something that I enjoy or I can learn things from. But you're exactly right. Americans cannot take culture and try to use it like they go down to the store and they can just try on something new, and this is kind of on the right. I find myself kind of in my own camp here is I don't look to Europe. Like I don't look at it as like a broad pantheon of European peoples rallying around some kind of banner together. I don't look at that. I don't feel like that's going to get us anywhere. I support them in their struggle for sovereignty. I want sovereignty in my own country, but I will not be able to try on. I can't go and be like, I'm I'm an English American. And this is what, there's not much to gain from that. What I can gain from and Americans should gain from is we do have centuries on this continent that have shaped who you are. And there needs to be some reflection on who you really are. We have our own traditions. We have our own story. We have our own places, our sacred places and our sacred things. And sometimes our narratives will intersect with one another and we have moments that we come together and we accomplish hard things together. That is uniquely ours. And Americans will find strength in that. They don't need to go searching for other people's strength. We do have it, but like I mentioned before, we have to become who we are. And that is harder for Americans than I think they really understand because it's subtle. It's like we talked earlier today about impulses and instincts, those deeper subtleties, the particular things. They're not sexy often, right? These are not things that they're not like that guy walking around with a 6-shooter and a 10-gallon hat. They're not a caricature. They're deeper.
And they're not as convenient as just a dictionary definition.
Exactly. Yeah, they're not. But I think that where I urge ordinary people to really explore what this is they have to do it with their real world commitments now. So it is your family. It is your neighborhood. These are those things. You will not go find this by searching for it, like going off to another place and just reinventing yourself. Americans do this, but the point is if you're looking for strength, you have to fight on the ground that you stand on. You have to play the cards you are dealt. You have to get in the game. And when you do that, like we mentioned before, that struggle, you will discover these things. They will unfold themselves to you. You will learn who you are. And that's how it's always been. But I couldn't agree more. Americans, especially on the right, need to recover who they are. They need to become who they are.
I see Johan Krugel is quoting Kestel here saying a volk red himself, a people saves itself. And that's absolutely a condensation of what I was saying as well. And I see Sideliner Opinions also makes a very important point. He says Americans must also not expect other cultures to appreciate the American culture and values as much as Americans do. That applies for everyone, applies for Afrikaners as well. it's also one of the points that Samuel Huntington makes in his book is in Clash of Civilizations is this hubris of thinking that non-Westerners are going to appreciate Western culture as much as Westerners do, and then running into a brick wall when you try to impose your universalism on the rest of the world. He has that great quote of what is universal for the West is imperialism for the rest, and this is a hard lesson that's also I think people are learning in the 21st century in particular.
Absolutely, and that's something that other cultures are better at. Americans are very open because we've always, I mean, we try to say it's just because of our ideals and our ideas, but it's really because we've always had a lot of space. Huge part of the American story. But I think Americans are starting to feel a lot more crowded. And like you mentioned, there are things that are uniquely ours. And I think some Americans can only appreciate those as they're being torn down or taken away. But this is why we have to understand that no one's going to fight for us, right? We're not going to convert the world to our ideas, and they're not going to fight for our kids and our homes and our communities. We're the only ones who can do that. And I think that we need to recover a sense of resilience and spine. And the only way to do that is to put your shoulder to the wheel, roll up your sleeves and get doing things, not just consuming news or consuming other people's opinions or, relying on a word to do the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting has always been done with sweat, blood, sweat, and tears. It's just the story. It's how everything that we hold and appreciate today was earned. We're no different. There's not been this end of history. Americans have to get back in the fight, and they got to recover who they are, and they don't need to have it theoretically planned out. That's another thing. Like, I find theory and all those things interesting, but again, it's those things are not going to save the day. It's always going to come down to that heavy lifting aspect of regular, ordinary people doing the hard work themselves, and that's where we're going to have a better future.
I see Gatskop Software says dankie Erns vir alles. Wel, is 'n absolute plesier Gatskop Software. I wanted to add there as well, when it comes to these questions of identity, you touched on something very important there, and it's the fact that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be just, there's not a quick fix. It's not just something that you can we live in the time of like 10 easy tricks on how to become a better, how to increase your salary, or 10 crazy ways in which you can become more successful. We live in that type of culture today, but there is no 10 easy tricks on how to gain a sense of identity. There is no secret formula for getting clarity on these matters, except going through struggle. Actually, as you said, putting shoulder to the wheel. In Afrikaans, you also have the same saying, om skouer aan die wiel te sit, and actually confronting them. And as I said earlier, and I can only I think it's worth repeating. That's why I'm so glad to see these types of discussions and questions actually coming to the fore. I don't think anyone is expecting answers to be found immediately. This is a long process, but at least you're knocking on the door, and that's very important. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, I'm putting you on the spot here with I think the difficult question, but I'm not expecting you to give the conclusive answer now. And that question is, what are, if not ideology or voting patterns or just these types of superficial things, if these are not the building blocks of identity, what are the crucial elements that have to be there? As I said, I'm not asking you to give me the recipe of a cake, but I'm asking you to, if you can, at least give me the basic ingredients. Like, there needs to be flour, there needs to be eggs, there needs to be baking powder, etc. What are those like basic building blocks of identity, not to any particular identity, just in general, that just have to be there in any conversation about these matters?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll offer three that I think are fundamental for Americans especially, and I imagine other peoples as well. For us, it is place. Place is crucial. You have to have place. Place is not just the plot of land. It's the relationships that exist on that plane. It is that it is yours. These are very important things. If you do not have that, you don't have a toehold into the world at all. You can't have a culture emerge in a place that this is why there's a big difference between peoples that have been conquered and do not own anything and do not have a place. They have to adapt to like an anti-culture in a way. It's very warped, and they lose their sense of who they are easily. People like this are easily enslaved, and that's the difference. So place is crucial. Another one is family, and with family, like I mentioned, with place will come other things as well. But family is really important because it is the most intimate and it's a pre-modern institution that encapsulates the most intimate relationships that we have. They're based on things of extreme trust, and they're based on things that are non-ideological. I will defend my brother almost no matter what he does, regardless of ideological differences. There's an element of obligation that is so important between a father and son, a mother and a daughter, a husband and wife, etc. That I don't think you cannot have a culture without a basis in family and those blood relations. And that can extend to other things like ethnicity and stuff. Like, I think those are things that do play a role. I think they get overemphasized in certain contexts, but I do think it's important because if you think about it, between nations and peoples, they're based on families, common families together. But I think that when we look at it for ourselves, we have kind of lost that. And so I think it's really important to analyze a little bit about what makes why family plays such a fundamental role. And so there's a lot that goes there, but I think family is another basic element. The last one I would say that gets overlooked too is a sense of spiritual mission. These do separate people, right? That spiritual mission, when it dies out, the people will die too. So it doesn't matter. You can have every other element lined up, but your civilization will die out. Your culture will die out if you lose that sense of spiritual mission. There's a distinctiveness. Most peoples that have this, they find themselves to be somewhat like chosen, blessed, guided by providence. There is an internal spiritual mission, and I don't think you can just borrow somebody else's. I can't go and adopt the Afrikaner spiritual mission or spiritual cohesiveness. It will not serve me, right? And so I think there are many other elements, like I mentioned before, that will branch out of those basic three things. But to me, those are the most fundamental. And if we don't have those, if we do not have those for ourselves, our culture will start to die. And I think you can see, if you look at problems in America, for example, one of those, or if not more of those elements, are slowly eroding or being taken away. And as that happens, the American people that were here will die out unless those things are recovered.
Well, those are all, I think, completely on the mark. I think that's the area where you need to be moving if you want to have a serious conversation about identity. One of those in particular, I think you can't overstate. Overstate its importance, and that's the idea of place. It's so important that people have that rootedness. You can't be rooted without a place, to put it very bluntly. I mean, one of the great Afrikaner intellectuals of our time today, Professor Dani Goosen, wrote a book called About Community and Place. And he particularly goes into the idea of place playing such a critical role when it comes to your sense of identity. For just an example, the school that you went to is not just a school, it's the school that you went to as a child. Your childhood home is not just a collection of walls and a plot of land, it is your childhood home where you formed as a person inside of. Your hometown or city or wherever you grew up is not just some collection of buildings and an economic zone. It is the place that formed you. Your country is not just an economic zone or a lines on a map. It is a place with texture, with history, with that had a very distinct impact on you as a person or a group as a collective. And it's a content creator that we both know, Jay Burden, has talked about that idea of the tyranny of just. All of these things, your Your childhood home is just a collection of walls. Your childhood, the town or city where you grew up in is just a collection of buildings. Your family is just a collection of people. It's such a acid. It really just destroys any sense of identity, and makes it impossible to form a sense of who you are. And to answer that question, who are you, if you just fall for this tyranny of just everything is just a collection of atoms, lines on a map, collection of buildings, just a random collection of people, not a family. And we have to really start adding that texture back to even the way we speak about these things. There needs to be a sentimentality connected to it. It is special. Your wife is not just some random woman. Your family is not just some random collection of people. Your country is not just some lines on a map. There's so much more to it. But you can't just say, you can't just stop there. You can't just say there's more to it. You should actually be able to explain, well, what is more to it? What is that depth? You should be able to give someone an idea. Now, we've only been chatting for an hour, so I don't expect you to now give me an in-depth idea of what it means to be an American, but you've touched on so many aspects that cement that idea that it is not just simply someone living within this territorial part or this territory called America. There's so many more layers and dimensions to it, but that's something that a lot of people seem to take for granted.
Absolutely, and it's enforced. I think that the problem that we're running up against is that those particular interests that we all have, and I make this argument quite often, is Americans have been stripped from participating in, ordinary Americans have been stripped from participating in the truly political. There are places where that can still be found, particularly at the local level. But it has become harder and harder for Americans to fight for their own interests because they also don't even know what they are. And we intellectualize things far too much. And this is often pushed on us through propaganda. But the fight requires us to put up some boundaries and to recover some things. And like you said, I mean, we are a lot, like, Americans need to become who they are. They are a lot more than what they are being propagandized to believe. And that propaganda can come from many places. It's not just from Washington. There is a response to that that also can be very misleading, because it's often, like we talked about, encouraging people to go down to the store and adopt, like I see these types all the time, like I'm a Viking, and I think that's great, fascinating history, but you're not. You're an American, and there's something about you. In fact, you're an American from a specific place, and you have a specific family, and you have beliefs about your soul that are unique to the place that you live in and to the person that you are. And that's very important. And I think a lot of people want to shy away from that. But I think that if they can recover that, and they do it humbly, I think that they can find a lot more strength to be able to stand up against what we're dealing with here. But until they can do that, they really can't advance their interests. They can't really participate in the political. Most of what they're doing will be cosmetic. It won't be fundamental and meaningful and life-changing. And this is why, I always give this kind of advice, and it irritates some people, but I think it's just very true. Young men and young women need to go out. They need to start families. They need to live in a place. They need to forge strong relationships with the people around them. They need to get their skin in the game, in the real world. And it can be done at the smallest level. But until you do that, you're really not going to be able to participate in this. You're not really in the fight anymore. And you will lose your identity. You will continue to become deracinated. And the hardest people to convince on this are usually deracinated Americans. And I don't use that to try to shame them, but there is a problem with deracination, of that uprootedness that many Americans feel. And so when you try to explain how important these things are, many of them will push back and say, well, I've lived my whole life and I don't have to worry about those things. I don't really need those. But I would argue that you do. And there will come a time when this fight will reach your front door and you will have nothing left and you won't have a way to resist. And so I do think we need to reclaim these things. We need to reinvest in these things. And it's really, I mean, it's difficult. It's a challenging road because we have a lot of opposition, but we were tailor made for this. And I think that we can reclaim those things, even though they are being attacked and delegitimized and stigmatized. I think we can, and the people that do will win.
Yeah, just a final thought there on the importance of place. I mean, it's that's why I write so much about it. It's you'll find the theme of the importance of place in the majority of my writing, and in particular answering questions like, why don't you just immigrate? Why don't you just leave South Africa? There's so many challenges. There's so many obstacles in your way, so many dangers, so many risks. And yeah, I'm not naive. I mean, how much time do you have? I can list all the dangers and risks and problems and issues that that I face on a daily basis as someone who lives in South Africa. I mean, I'm not naive to it, and I'm not going to deny it. But at the same time, there is also a price to leaving a place. I mean, my ancestors have been here since 1688. I'm the 9th generation of my ancestors here. My ancestors have been in Southern Africa longer than the United States has been a country. So, I mean, these are important matters. They can't just be brushed off as, well, when the going gets tough somewhere, you can just move to another place where things get better. No. The tide and the water is going to keep rising, and at some point you're going to run out of higher ground to flee to. So somewhere you have to make a stand. And here in South Africa, amongst my people, the Afrikaners, I've got a very good chance of actually building something meaningful for future generations that future generations can benefit from, because I already am standing on quite solid ground when it comes to a sense of identity. If I were to uproot and go to another country and raise a family there, I would be setting them up for an identity crisis, because on the one side, they know that they come from this rich history of Afrikaners, but at the same time, they're living in a country where they're a foreigner. So when it comes to the importance of place, I try to write and talk about it as much as possible, because I think it's definitely been neglected. We live in a world where the liberal mantra goes, or the globalist mantra goes, well, the world is your oyster. Just go where it's nice and go where there's opportunities. Well, that's to a large extent what got us into this mess, and what is making the mess even worse is that we just live in this nomadic mindset of moving almost like a prosperity mercenary. You just go wherever the prosperity is, and then you move when that dries up, you move on to the next opportunity, and that's just not sustainable. That is an identity shredder. That's going to that causes mass deracination and confusion and stress and depression. It causes people to get to that state where they struggle to find meaning in their lives. I mean, I get a lot of meaning personally from the fact that I'm fighting for a cause that will benefit future generations of my people. That's an amazing feeling. But not a lot of people seem to have that experience. But that's a direct product of the world that we live in, with that philosophy of, oh, well, you're just part of the human race. The whole world is your country. Borders are just lines on a map. Whether you live in America or England or India or China, you just were plopped down somewhere random by whatever force governs this world, and now you can go set out create your own destiny. And as you rightly pointed out, you can't escape the fact that you were born with a particular identity, you were born into a particular context, and you were given an identity to a large extent, and you don't have control over that. That's part of you, and you better be nurturing that identity and be finding out what the building blocks of it is. But yeah, I've been rambling long enough on that thought. I just wanted to ask you, as we start wrapping up here, a final thought there on particularly the way forward. So when it comes to, I mean, we've already touched on the fact that it will require struggle, it will require deliberate, focused thinking, and it will require a lot of hard work to regain a strong sense of identity in the American context, and I think in many other places. But regular people, ordinary people that maybe don't have a massive platform, that don't, for example, weren't blessed with the talents of writing and speaking or being able to push and pull the zeitgeist. What can an ordinary Joe, regular person do to contribute towards everything we've been talking about here tonight? That when we're talking about hard work, doing your part to find answers to these difficult questions, what can the regular guy do? Is there a place for just any person without even without a platform or particular background, like an academic background in studying identity and culture and ethnicity and everything? What can the regular person do to contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the answer to many of our problems will be ordinary people doing what needs to be done. Ordinary people are the backbone. They're the ones who produce things. They're the ones who live authentic lives. And even though, someone like me or you, we have platforms and we can share ideas, which has value. I think that's very important. But it's not everything, right? It's not even the most important thing. Like, we need people who know how to do things. We need people who know how to fix things. We need people who know how to raise good children. We need people who know how to create order from chaos, who know how to make things beautiful. They might not be able to express that or advocate for that on a large platform, but that is so important. And this is why I encourage people to take their gaze off of the center of power, to obviously be aware of what's happening, but your priorities need to be re-examined continually. And those priorities are most important on what's closest to you. The most important thing I do is not being on Twitter or writing. I like it. I love it. I don't denigrate it. It's not the most important thing I do. I'm raising children. I have a wife. I go to church. I'm a member of my community. I do what I can locally with the relationships that I have to better the place that I live in, to protect it, to take care of it. That is the most important thing that I do. And if my priorities start to focus and shift on things like this, like on writing or other things, then I'm on the wrong path. So I think all of us have different talents. All of us have different capabilities. Not everybody's made to be a leader or a spokesman, but not everybody's, leaders and spokesmen can't fix sewage systems. They can't repair things. They can't keep the lights on. I have a lot of respect and admiration for people that have a plethora of different skills that they can use to make the world better. So this is why I think all of us need to do some self-examination and understand where we fit and being somebody who knows where you like, who can lend your strengths to something that you're already good at, is way more important than everybody trying to be the same. If everybody trying to have a platform or everybody trying to share or spread the ideas, they are so much more valuable. So I encourage people to seize the ground that they stand on. There's an infrastructure that's already in place that they can build out. There are relationships that they already have. They belong to a family. They were born to parents somewhere. If they're married, they have a spouse. If they have children, we need to live deliberately. We need to live on our terms. We need to be able to say no to things. We need to be able to put boundaries up in our own lives and live deliberately. Americans are obsessed with the concept of liberty, but liberty is something that is practiced. It is something that we have to, like, freedom is not just this ethereal thing that we reach for. It's something that you have to live and you have to cherish and protect. If we live deliberately and we lend our strengths to the things that we're good at, to live freer, to live better, these things will have much greater impact on the future than sharing ideas all the time or talking about theory or watching the news. And I think that that's why we have to reorient our priorities. Those three things that we talked about: place, family, that spiritual mission, that spiritual sense of who we are. If those things are lacking in our lives, we are ineffective. We will not be able to do much or contribute much. We'll probably just cause more problems. So these are things on an individual level all of us can do. I think that people need to do this. And then they will discover, life is full of mystery, and that's a great thing. We like mystery. Mystery is good. when we do these things, these the mystery of life will unfold itself to us. This is a process. But I think this is a generational fight. We need to have that perspective. The things that you do now will serve future generations if you do them well. So if we have that kind of perspective, then, losing some battles here and there now, being on our heels every now and then will not destroy us. It will not make us despair. We'll be able to push through and recognize that this fight that we have is long term, but we can win it.
I think that's the perfect place to end it. I think this is a prickly subject. It's an uncomfortable subject. I can see even today, if I bring up matters of identity, I can see how some, not just Americans, many people in America and beyond, almost kind of shy away. They get uncomfortable. They start fidgeting in their seat. It has been a topic that's been has certain taboos attached to it. It has made many people uncomfortable. And on the other side of the coin is many people who are not uncomfortable with it have been writing it off as just, it's self-explanatory. We don't have to talk about this. We've sorted this out. Everyone knows what an American is. Why are you wasting my time? There's more important stuff to be talking about, like the economy and taxes. And both of those, whether shying away from the question because you are uncomfortable with it, or avoiding the question of who are we because you think it's settled, are both simultaneously reasons that got Westerners to this point where now we're deep in trouble, many Western nations and peoples, when it comes to questions like who are we, because that question has been neglected and avoided so much that now we have to almost not reinvent the wheel, but we have to rediscover the wheel that was invented a while back. So I'm very glad that we can have conversations like this. If I can create a platform where these conversations happen, it's my tiny little humble contribution to a much larger conversation that has to be had. Publications like IM 1776, publishing dialogues like yours on these matters are absolutely crucial. We have to destigmatize them, and we have to get people talking and debating and arguing about these issues. But talk, we have to. We can't just write them off or avoid them because they make us uncomfortable. But Lafayette Lee, thank you very much for your insights and time tonight. I've kept you long enough, but it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I know the audience enjoyed it as well. They're already letting me know in the chat from what I can see.
Well, I just really do appreciate it. It was my honor. I really respect what you're doing and your work. I love your piece for I Am was probably one of my very favorites I've ever read. And I think that your fight, even though it's not the same as our fight, it's similar in the sense that I derive a lot of strength from watching you struggle and make ground. I really do appreciate what you are doing, especially for those that you care about. And I think Americans can take a lot of heart by watching what you're doing and the things you're achieving. So thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. The comments were great. You have a great listener base, and I hope we can do it again.
No, well, the compliments are streaming in. I'm very glad that the audience enjoyed the conversation as well. My last question to you is just an administrative one. It's very simple. Where can people find your work if they are interested in your writing or just your thoughts in general?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm a contributing editor for IM 1776. People can find my writing there. I have a Substack. It's called ruins.substack.com. Very basic. I write a lot about history, and I do talk about identity there. And then I'm on Twitter at Lafayette Lee or at @partisan_O. But yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, and I would definitely recommend people go check out your work. There are links in the description to all of those places. So if you're too lazy to go search in the search bar, I've made it convenient for you. It's all in the description. Lastly, just thank you very much to everyone that tuned in. Thank you for all your questions and comments and being part of the conversation. I love putting your additions or everything you put in the live chat on the screen. It forms part of the content. I really appreciate it. And if you're new to this channel and you like these types of conversations, consider subscribing. And also, if you're watching and it's no longer live, you can still take part in the conversation and add your thoughts by going to the comment section, put your comments, your thoughts, your questions, everything there. I read all of them and respond to as many as I can. Lafayette Lee, have a great rest of your day, and we'll chat again real soon.
Thank you.
And to my audience, cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.